Hello, my name is Beth Walsh-Moorman, and today I'm going to be presenting on Bloom's Taxonomy 2.0. During today's presentation, I hope to give you an overview of the taxonomy and look at the changes that the updated Bloom's 2.0 have included. I'm going to discuss how to use Bloom's taxonomy to identify learning outcomes at the lesson, course, and program levels. And then we'll talk about tips for writing effective learning outcomes at any level. Bloom's taxonomy was introduced in 1956 by Benjamin Bloom and his collaborators Max Engelhardt, Edward First, Walter Hill, and David Crothwell. Together, they set out to develop a framework to identify the appropriate conditions for learning and to describe the cognitive processes of learning required for learning and developing mastery of a subject. The researchers wanted to develop a classification system for the cognitive domains. They had also planned to create similar frameworks for the affective and psychomotor domains, but their work on what became Bloom's taxonomy became very time consuming, and other researchers eventually created similar frameworks for the other domains. This ambitious project became the central focus of much of Benjamin Bloom's professional career. The major idea was that what educators want students to know and do, their educational objectives, can be arranged in a hierarchy from more to less complex. The pyramid shape was chosen to depict the concept that the foundational knowledge must be addressed first before the next level can be mastered. What emerged was a widely adopted framework used by educators across the education spectrum. Definitions, sample verbs, and sample behaviors were developed for each of the levels. For instance, knowledge was defined as the ability to recall or recognize information, ideas, and principles, and the approximate form in which they were learned. Teachers addressing this level of the taxonomy might write learning objectives that read, "A student is able to list or label items on a map or in a diagram." A sample behavior for the lowest level of the pyramid might be that students are able to list and define, say, the 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Because these domains are hierarchical, students must be able to master such tasks before moving on to comprehension, where they might be asked to paraphrase or describe this new learning in their own words. In the original version, Bloom set evaluation as the highest level, requiring learners to appraise, assess, or critique based on standards and criteria. That is, students might be asked to effectively judge a work of literature or recommend a procedure based on desired outcomes. Such a task would rely on the processes that were mastered in the lower domains. While the taxonomy was widely adopted and educators were familiar with its concepts, some concerns arose. First, the framework was essentially developed before cognitive science emerged, and so some of the assumptions are not grounded in science. Secondly, teachers often did not recognize the relationship between the higher thinking skills and the lower thinking skills, and valued those lower thinking skills less, often using the taxonomy as a way to identify the higher ordered skills without considering, for instance, what knowledge is needed to achieve such learning goals. That is, knowledge and comprehension of such knowledge was the precursor for higher level skills. Daniel Willingham, who is quoted on this slide, is a very important contemporary cognitive psychologist whose body of work has identified the dependent nature of the higher ordered skills on those below it. Knowledge reinforced by recall and retrieval enters our long-term memory and supports our higher order thinking. By 2001, 2 students of Benjamin Bloom, Laurie Anderson and David Crothwell, who you might recall was one of the original authors of the framework, engaged in the process of reinventing the taxonomy for the modern education. The most obvious changes are that the team opted for the active verbs as the classification, focusing the taxonomy on the learner rather than on the teacher. Thus, we have remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating as the domains. In addition, the 2 top categories were swapped, emphasizing that learners should be able to demonstrate full knowledge by applying what they've learned in creating something new, either conceptual or tangible. Therefore, writing, designing, and modifying are the behaviors that are most important at this highest level. The revised taxonomy was further refined to look at and explore how the cognitive processes, remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating, might be deployed in different knowledge dimensions. Therefore, the cognitive processes of remembering will look different in the various knowledge dimensions. These dimensions are arranged from concrete, the more concrete, to the more abstract, with factual being the most concrete and metacognitive being the most abstract. Now, it's important to realize that this is not perfect, and you have to consider, because perhaps for instance, some procedural knowledge dimension might actually be less abstract than conceptual knowledge. However, it's important for teachers to consider not just the cognitive dimension or the thinking that the students are going to be needing to deploy, but also the knowledge that they're going to be using and gaining in that thinking. This table shows the types of tasks that can be used at the various knowledge and cognitive process dimensions. By looking at both the knowledge dimension and the cognitive processes, we're able to consider learning objectives, organize those objectives in order to plan and deliver instruction, design valid assessment tasks, and ensure that assessment and instruction align. That is, if our teaching was largely in the factual dimension, we must consider what creation might look at that level. This means that the tasks we often identify as higher level thinking and value as educators do have appropriate uses in even our 100 level courses. But we have to consider what it is we might ask our students to create. In other words, students can know about a topic in different ways and at different levels. Please note that the cognitive dimension is often treated differently because it is focused on building students' self-awareness, control, and regulation of their own learning. So let's look at and consider how using Bloom's 2.0 might help us with developing learning outcomes. It is important to consider what levels of learning applies in the cognitive domains. In lower level classes, it's likely that students will be asked to perform tasks that are at the base of the pyramid, remembering or understanding. But still, you have to consider what knowledge domain you're working on. If they're working with very abstract ideas, even remembering and understanding are very, very challenging. In lower level classes, we're probably going to be working very largely in the factual knowledge domain. When working in the factual domain, it is likely that even in lower level classes, the students will be asked to perform some tasks that are very cognitively demanding. So this new change allows us to address that concern that teachers weren't looking at those foundational skills that were required and important and necessary for success at the higher order thinking skills. So let's consider the task of remembering. Remembering and comprehending new ideas probably dominate your 100 and 200 level courses. But by junior and senior year, there is an assumption that students have a working understanding of the terminologies and processes that you will be using in your course. You probably won't have many remembering and understanding objectives in a junior or senior level class. However, even in a graduate program, if an idea is radically new or a concept is radically new to the learner, you may need to build the foundational knowledge, go back to that remembering and understanding before moving up the taxonomy and asking them to work at a higher cognitive demand on those concepts. Learning objectives should be measurable. There are verb tables that you can use. I'll show you one in a minute that can help you to consider the verbs to use that represent your objectives. Course level objectives are directly assessed, and your daily class activities and formative assessments should align with those objectives. It may take several lesson level objectives to achieve mastery of a course level objective. You should consider what you expect students to master by the end of the course and then build your lesson level objectives from there. In other words, if formative assessment proves that your students can do the objectives of every class, then they will master the course objectives. Program level objectives are not directly assessed and tend to remain fairly broad. There are several great resources out there that can help you match the cognitive domains with the appropriate action verbs, activities, and texts or apps. Learning objectives should include measurable verbs and should be written with only one verb. Lesson level objectives should not be higher than course level objectives in the cognitive domains. So let's take a minute and look at this relationship between the lesson level and the course level. So here is a course level objective. Discuss the changing global landscape of the business and for businesses and other organizations that are driving change in the global environment. This is what you would consider an understanding level, cognitive level. So this is pretty foundational in it on the Bloom's Taxonomy 2.0. So my lessons, I'm going to take several lessons to build to this course level objective, right? To get my students ready to master the course level objective. So for example, on the remembering level, I might say that my students are going to identify the key roles of the World Trade Organization. That's just a remembering, and then maybe getting them up to understanding. For an understanding, I might ask my students to do some research and report on a trade dispute that was brought to the WTO. And so you can see that both of my lesson level objectives are related to the course level and help me get my students to the point where they're going to be able to master the course level objective. Also note that neither one of my lesson level objectives are of a higher cognitive demand than the course level. That's very important. We want to make sure that our course level objectives reflect the cognitive domain that we expect our students to be working in. Here's an example from one of my own courses. So I teach in the adolescent and adult program in the School of Education. And in that capacity, one of the things I do is teach the courses for students who are the literacy courses for students who are going to be teaching in the high school levels. And so a typical course level objective for me might say something like, using an understanding of how adolescents create meaning from text, teacher candidates will sequence lessons that support student meaning making of texts. So that's an application, because I'm asking them to actually apply their understanding of learning of reading theories, right? Well, on the lesson level, and it's going to take me a while to get there, on the lesson level, one of the things that I might do is have a lesson where my objective is that I'm going to have my students define the transactional theory of reading. This is one of the foundational theories of reading, and it's something that I would introduce to my students on the foundational level, on the remembering level, so that I am getting them to at least be able to identify the theory itself. As we move through and work with that theory, I may get to the point where I'm going to ask them to apply that theory by revising a lesson plan. So one of the aspects of the transactional theory of reading is that we allow students an aesthetic response to a text, and that not everything is about information or an efferent response to a text. So therefore, I might ask them to revise a lesson plan to identify an aesthetic a way to allow students to have an aesthetic response to a text. Now, this is going to help me to get to that course level objective, but there's other theories that I'm going to need to introduce in order for my students to be able to understand how adolescents create meaning from texts. And so I'm going to introduce other theories and other concepts, often at the lower level, before I can get them to the point where they can apply those, synthesize that, and apply the learning on the course level to meet the course level objective. So what are program levels? Well, program level of learning objectives are there's generally 3 to 7 of them. And they're different in that, just like it takes several lessons to meet a course level objective, it's going to take several courses to meet a program level objective. So we want these to identify what we think the graduates will do as a result of having been in our program. They should be transparent, specific, measurable in that they can be demonstrated and seen, and they should be learner-centered. Here's an example of a program level objective. Explain continuity and change over time, place, gathering, organizing, and interpreting evidence from primary and/or secondary sources that are relevant to particular historical contexts and appropriate to a particular discipline and/or course methodologies. So you can see the students are going to need a lot of exposure to primary, secondary sources, different historical contexts, different disciplines and methodologies in order to be able to meet that programmatic learning outcome. Here's one for psychology. Discuss the history of psychology within the primary area of study, including the impact of scientific revolutions, theory shifts, etc., on the choice of research questions and methods. Again, you can see how in order to meet this program level outcome, students are going to need some coursework on the history of psychology, on research methods. They're going to need to know about psychology theories, right? And so this is something that's going to take several courses in order for my students or the learner to be able to get to the program level outcome. All right, so what should we keep in mind about writing objectives? Well, there are three things that I think are important for us to remember. The one is to be specific, second is to be measurable, and the third is to be concise. So let's look at each of these one at a time and kind of look at how we might revise a learning objective in order to make sure that it's specific, measurable, and concise. I also want to mention that writing good learning objectives takes time, and it might take you several times through a course to be able to get to your objectives to the place where you want them to be. So let's talk about being specific. So I want to move from vague to clear. And so let's look at an example of a vague learning objective. Students will learn from programming language Python. Okay, what will they learn and how will I know that they learn it? So let's look at the improved version of that. Students will use the programming language Python to complete data mining analysis. So I'm much more specific about what it is my students are going to be doing with this languaging program. The next one is to be measurable. So here's one that would be really hard for me to be able to say whether or not all of the students in my class have met this objective. Students will know the elements of the periodic table. How will they know that, right? I'm not really identifying exactly, is it by naming them? Is it by labeling them? Is it by symbol? So if I wanted to rewrite that to improve it, so I'm making it clear how I'm going to measure that goal, I would change it to students will be able to identify the elements from the periodic table based on their symbols. So now I'm able to measure, do they know the symbols? How many symbols do they know? I also want to worry about being concise. Now there's a saying that's attributed to Mark Twain that I've used several times with my students that says, Mark Twain supposedly wrote one of his friends and said, sorry, this letter is so long, I didn't have time to edit it. And I think that's important to remember that, you know, writing is a process and it does take time. So a wordy, imprecise phrasing of a learning objective might say, students will be able to apply one of the many theories of social psychology and apply those theories to a number of real world situations. This is problematic both for me as a teacher to really understand what it is that I want my students to achieve, but also for students. Imagine being a learner in that class and trying to figure out what behavior we want to see from our students. You know, also thinking about the fact that one of the knowledge domains is metacognition. We want our students to be able to develop the ability to regulate and control their own learning. So a much better, more concise version of that would be to say students will be able to apply theories of social psychology to real world problems. Now that is very quickly I can identify the behavior that I'm going to need to see from my students. There are a lot of resources out there for you as you embark on writing and rewriting course level, lesson level, and program level objectives. I use several of them in this presentation, but certainly there are a lot more out there. If you would like me to help you to identify some resources for you, here's my contact information. I am available in Garfield. I'm in Garfield A5, as well as there is my email address. So thank you very much, and thank you for spending some time with me.